So this was total emissions. The next thing we're going to talk about is still at the country level, but looking at per capita emissions. Per capita can technically be defined quite a few ways, but when we're talking about per capita on a country level, what we mean is really per person. So the last slide was just, hey, how much emissions did China release into the atmosphere? This is saying, on average, how much did each person release? And this is important because this is actually shedding light as to how people are living. China just had a whole bunch of people, and so that's why they had such high emissions. But if you actually look at China, they're one of the lightest colors on here. They have some of the least amount of carbon dioxide emissions per person. And so it's not really China living above its means. It's not these people who are using way more electricity or stuff than normal. It's just there's so many of them. But there's a lot of other countries around the world that are a lot worse off, like the United States, like Canada, like Australia, where maybe we weren't releasing that much totally, but we are releasing a lot on a per person basis. But we're not the worst, which is nice. Whereas the worst is a couple countries here in Saudi Arabia, or the Arabian Peninsula. Qatar is actually the number one bad one, and the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. I say bad in the sense of the highest per capita emissions. And there's a couple of reasons for this. So this area of the world is known for oil. And if you are drilling for oil in your backyard, why would you get solar panels? You have access to oil and it's cheap. Actually, in a lot of places in the Middle East, it's free because it's so cheap to produce. It's being produced right there. It's either free or heavily subsidized, meaning that it's heavily discounted. So if you have access to this resource, then you're going to use it. The second thing is that this is a desert and it's really freaking hot all the time. So air conditioning, right? And that's on all the time. These are over 100-degree days every single day. Like, they're cranking the AC. But the third, kind of most impressive and scariest, is their, how do I put this? Their extravagant use of resources. Because again, huge oil companies come with huge money. So what we're looking at is an indoor ski rink in the UAE, in the middle of a desert. There's snow. There's a freaking ski lift. This is inside of a mall. The crazy amount of money and resources that are in this country is insane. And so they can afford to do things like this, which don't make sense. Well, I guess it makes sense, right? If you're going to go skiing somewhere, like, this is your only chance. But my point being is that the amount of air conditioning in something like this is insane. Better yet, here's a picture of it from the outside. If you look, it is open underneath, it is open on the sides, it's open on top, meaning it's not even insulated, right? You have this 100-degree weather on top of the ski slope, on the side of the ski slope, underneath of the ski slope. It is freaking hot every single direction. So it doesn't even get some natural insulation. So they're just cranking up the electricity, which is mostly fueled by fossil fuels, because they can, right? They're not paying for it, or it's crazy cheap, so they're going to do it. So it's kind of cool, right? Like, if I were to go to this country, I would totally go skiing there. And so would a lot of people, which is not helping the cause. Really cool feature, but again, it has a huge implication to greenhouse gas emissions. All right, let's bring it a little bit closer to home. So we're going to look across the United States, and similar to countries, we're going to look at total emissions. So how much is being released as a whole from that state. And this very closely follows population, right? The more the more people you have, the more emissions are going to be. So Texas and California has some of the highest emissions. I don't know offhand. I think California has more people, but they also have more environmental laws. But Texas, really freaking hot in Texas, right? You have to drive everywhere to get somewhere. And then the other thing is they have a lot of oil drilling there as well. If it's being drilled in your backyard, it's going to be super cheap. There's no incentive for green technologies when you have very easy and very cheap access to fossil fuels. If you look for, say, Maryland, Maryland's pretty far down here, which again makes sense. We have a pretty small population. So again, total emissions typically are going to follow population. Definitely exceptions, but we see that here in the US as well. But what's more interesting is looking at it on a per capita basis. On a per person basis, which state's doing the best? And usually, I say which state's doing the best or which state's doing the worst. And usually everyone gets this wrong. They're like, oh, the worst one's New York, right? You got New York City, California because they've got LA and San Francisco, Illinois because they have Chicago. But it's actually the opposite. Those states that have big cities are some of the best per capita emissions. So I'm going to actually look at the best ones. Look, DC, New York, California, Maryland, all of these states, some of the best per capita emissions on a per person basis. We're not really releasing that much. Let's look at the other end though. Wyoming, North Dakota, West Virginia. So these three, one of the major things they have in common is coal. Coal production and coal mining. So they are the ones that are mining this coal, but they are also burning it. We've seen this before. If this is coming out of your backyard, it's going to be a lot cheaper. Your electricity bills are cheaper. There's not a big incentive for, say, solar power because those panels are really freaking expensive and you can get coal for a whole lot cheaper. And money drives our economy. Money drives our, I guess, sense of accomplishment and making sure we retire. So if we can save money by using coal versus solar power, people take advantage of it. Another thing too, so Wyoming actually has the smallest population in the United States. Usually the only city that people can list in Wyoming is its capital, Cheyenne, and that's it. So if you want to go to the grocery store, you're probably driving a half hour. If you want to go to your neighbor's house, you're probably driving 10 minutes. If you want to go anywhere, you are driving a lot. So the miles driven, aka how much gas is used, is a lot higher. On the flip side, it's still kind of related, but thinking about New York or California or DC, we have lots of public transportation, right? It's not uncommon for people to just not own a car at all, and they rely on public transportation. So that lowers emissions. Also, people in these really big cities typically live in apartments. Apartments are some of the most, I guess, environmentally friendly dwelling because you have great insulation. You know, I'm sitting in an apartment right here. I've got a neighbor right there. I've got a neighbor above me. I got a neighbor below me. I have a neighbor on my other side of me. There's a small hallway and I've got another neighbor over here. I am insulated, meaning that if the wind blows, it is coming into my apartment on one wall. If you're in a single family house, it is coming from all four walls and the roof. And so you have a lot less insulation, meaning that you're probably using your heat more and using your AC a lot more than, say, I do. Over this entire winter, I, no lie, probably turned on the heater twice. It stays at about 70 degrees in my apartment because we have the insulation of all these other units. And in these really big cities, like, you're not going to live in New York City and have a 4-bedroom house all to yourself and not connected to another building. So having high rises, having all these apartment buildings is actually better, at least when it comes to our emissions. So although I'm not going to expect you to remember, like, Wyoming is number 1, North Dakota is number 2, you should know Wyoming, North Dakota, and West Virginia are the top ones, and states that have big cities, DC, California, New York, are some of the bottom ones. And just know some reasons why that trend exists. Okay, so I know that was a lot of graphs, but hopefully you learned something new and something kind of interesting about us in Maryland, how we're doing, but also what's happening around the world and happening to our other states and how their lifestyles, how their economies kind of dictate their carbon dioxide emissions. And again, this is what shows us where policies need to be put in place. If Wyoming is so high on a per person basis, is there something we should be doing about where they're getting their electricity from? If California has a higher population, but Texas is nearly double their emissions, well, what's going on there? What policies are working? What policies aren't working? So incredibly important from a policy point of view to kind of understand what's happening. And if you can understand what's happening, then it's a lot easier to be more successful with future projects that are being taken.